of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies here at Northwestern. I know people are still filing in and getting out of the waiting room. So as we're, the last few people are joining us, I just want to say a couple of brief words of introduction. First of all, I'm delighted that we're able to host our wonderful speakers, Shai Hassani and discussant Wendy Perlman of Northwestern. You'll hear much more about the two of them in just a moment when they're introduced by our moderator for today. Let me say, however, that for those who have not joined us for the last couple of events in this series, today's talk on new books in Israel studies is the third of four that are devoted to highlighting recent trends and new scholarship and sort of cutting edge research in the field of the study of the state of Israel. And our fourth and final event in this lineup is scheduled for March 30th at noon, so just under a month away. It's going to feature David Barak-Gorodetsky of the University of Chicago speaking about his book, which is devoted to a biography of Judah Magnus. And I'm delighted to say that this event on March 30th, the fourth and final event in this series, is going to be held in person here on campus. We will have a Zoom link. It's going to be sort of a hybrid event where people will be able to log in and to participate virtually, but there will be certainly an in-person component as well. And so anyone who's here listening is warmly invited to join us on campus. This is going to be our first public event that is held in person in quite a long time, and I can say that we're all very, very excited for it, and just hoping that things continue to improve from a public health perspective, so that a month from now we can proceed as planned. More details on that on our website, www.jewish-studies.northwestern.edu, and we'll also putting up some information at the end of today's event about that fourth coming event in the series. Other information about other terrific events that we're going to be hosting over the next few months, also available on the website. So I would strongly encourage everyone to take a look. Let me just quickly say a word of thanks to Dr. Mayan Hillel, who's the postdoctoral fellow for the study of Israel studies at Northwestern. She's been the guiding force behind this series and has just done amazing, wonderful work to make it a reality. So I know we're all very, very grateful to her. And I will now turn it over to the moderator for today's event, Scott Abramson, who I'll just briefly introduce. Scott is a historian of the modern Middle East and currently a postdoctoral fellow in Israel studies at the Crown Family Center here at Northwestern. His research is concerned with the post-Ottoman experience of the Middle East's minorities, with special reference to their relations with the state of Israel. He's published a number of different articles which have appeared in popular publications, Tablet Magazine and others, as well as in scholarly journals like the Levantine Review, the Journal of the Middle East and Africa, and so on. And these days, when he's not moderating events for us, he's at work on a book that traces the history of Israel's secret decade-plus alliance with the Kurds of Iraq. I know that probably we're all eager to learn more about that topic at some future date. I hope we'll be able to. But for today, I'll turn it over to him to introduce our speaker and our discussant. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Shaiovitz. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this, the third session of the Crown Center's four-part series, New Books in Israel Studies. It is our great pleasure to present the author of one such book, Professor Shai Hassani. By way of format, first, Professor Hassani will give a synopsis of his book. Then Professor Wendy Perlman, whom we're pleased to have with us as a discussant, will give her comments on the book. And finally, you in the audience will have the opportunity to address your questions to Professors Hassani and Perlman. Shai Hassani is an assistant professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. His research and teaching focus on the social and cultural history of Israel, Palestine, and on Middle Eastern Jewry. He is the author of Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War, the book under consideration today. It was brought out by Stanford University Press last year. Professor Hassani received his PhD in History and Judaic Studies from New York University. his master's degree in Arab Studies from Georgetown University, and his BA in Middle Eastern Studies from Tel Aviv University. He has been involved in various struggles over archival declassification policies in Israel. In 2019, he petitioned the Israeli Supreme Court, together with the Association for Civil Rights, to compel the Israeli Domestic Intelligence Service, the Shin Bet, to open its archives to the public. Prior to his academic career, Professor Hassani worked as a journalist covering the West Bank and the Israeli military. I now refer you to Professor Hassani.
Thank you so much. Let me make sure everyone hears me well. Thank you so much, Scott, and the Crown Center for inviting me. And I also want to thank Maya Milel for her work organizing this event. I am thrilled to be in conversation with Wendy Perlman in just a little bit. And thanks also to everyone who tuned in. I know many are preoccupied with what is going on in Ukraine, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us. I don't know if you all saw the Ukrainian ambassador's speech to the UN 2 days ago. He read aloud the series of these distraught texts from a Russian soldier to his mother, allegedly written minutes before the soldier's death. Obviously, we don't know if this was a genuine exchange or a propaganda ploy, but I would say that the language of the exchange, especially surrounding the killing of civilians, is a familiar one that is found often in writing of soldiers during war. And that writing, not about, quote unquote, what really happened, but rather the visceral reactions that events provoked in real time, is also the focus in Dear Palestine. And of course, the sources that I use are primarily these personal letters from the 48 war. Now, the exchange between the Russian soldier and his mother was presumably captured on the dead body of the Russian soldier. And actually, some of the letters that I use in Dear Palestine have a similar origin. Other letters did not originate from soldiers themselves, but rather from this, rather nefarious intelligence collection apparatus, a sort of 1948 incarnation of the NSA, or Israel Unit 8200, for those familiar. It was called the Postal Censorship Bureau, and it was, of course, an organ of the Israeli intelligence community. And what it did is that it secretly intercepted and copied handwritten letters of Jews and Arabs on a massive scale in order to extract their views on topics which were of interest to the Israeli leadership. So sort of mundane, everyday writing and conversation, polite, impolite, politically correct, and racist discourse, but also these firsthand narratives of huge historic dramas. And we'll see of an individual's decision, to kill their neighbor during a civil war or drive them out of their homes. These intercepted communication, of course, also include the flip side, right? Narratives by victims of such violence reflecting on sorrow and survival. And it's obviously a massive breach of privacy of countless individuals, but it is also a treasure trove for historians. And hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit more about this unique nature of the sources. But let me start with what those sources actually tell us about the 1948 war. So here we go. First, for those unfamiliar with the 48 war, known by Palestinians as the Nakba, Arabic for disaster, and by Jewish Israelis as the War of Independence. It lasted some 20 months and resulted in Israeli independence and the erasure of much of Arab Palestine. About 500 Arab villages were depopulated by Jewish forces, and about 750,000 Palestinians, or 3/4 of the Palestinian population, became refugees. Now, Dear Palestine is as I mentioned, based on hundreds of personal letters of ordinary Jews and Palestinian and other Arabs who came to Palestine to fight in 1948 as volunteers, and of course, some of them were born there. Now, their narratives destabilize our notions of fixed Arab and Jewish identities, or at least that's my claim. And they remind us that just because the David Ben-Gurion or Amin al-Hassanis say things were a certain way, the Jews and Palestinian fought under this banner or that flag, that alone does not mean that's how things played out. And so what I set out to do in Dear Palestine is examine the way non-elites interacted with elite narratives promoted during the 48 war. And in broad terms, the book depicts these identities and spaces that are information, as well as normal, everyday people's fear, bravery, failure, arrogance, cruelty, lies, and exaggerations. So I just overpromised very grandly what Dear Palestine does. Now let me try and convince you that it delivers. The book takes the readers on this 5-part journey that was undertaken by many young men and women who participated in the war. And you can see those 5 distinct sections that are sort of visualized here on the screen. I'll quickly walk you through them, and then we'll give us an opportunity to look at some of the sources. So the first sort of stop, so to speak, in this journey is the mobilization of Jews and Arabs in their countries of origin. There was a significant but little known activity carried out by societies and parties and tribes to recruit men and women to fight in Palestine in 1948. Both Zionist and Arab mobilizers drew upon a certain collective logic that they believe existed among potential recruits. Arab mobilizers appealed to this pan-Arab sentiment, and in the Jewish world, Zionist mobilizers appealed to what I call a sort of pan-Judaic sense of duty that they believe Jews harbored, whether Zionists or not. So let me give you an example of this sort of mobilization in European DP camps, where Holocaust survivors were concentrated in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was actually pretty difficult to convince Holocaust survivors to go and fight in Palestine 3 years after surviving the Nazi extermination campaign. And to do so, in February of 1948, the Zionist leadership had somewhat of a wild idea: declare that all DP residents were now de jure under the jurisdiction of the Jewish National Council in Palestine, and hence subject to the mandatory conscription that was already enforced there. Now, this was not an abstract idea. By May of 48, DP camp residents received these draft orders that were signed by the State of Israel, where each individual was ordered to report for conscription and threatened that failing to do so will be regarded as defection. Now, still, many attempted to evade conscription by all means possible, and those draft dodgers, so to speak, were a primary target for propaganda campaigns in the camps. One pamphlet distributed in a German DP camp was called The Trial of a Dodger. It included this entire transcript, likely fictional, of a trial against a Holocaust survivor who refused to be sent to fight in Palestine. And like propaganda often does, this tract also had some very radical language, presenting the Arabs in Palestine as the orchestrators of a second Holocaust. And let's take a look. This is what this Yiddish pamphlet puts forward. The same Nazi hand in a new garb started to put out the only eliminating torch, that is the Jewish state, for the sons of Zion. The Jewish Yishuv is facing a cruel reality: be exterminated or fight till the last man for the future of the country and the Jewish people. Now, according to this narrative related in the pamphlet, the defendant had lost all his family in the Holocaust, which prompted his refusal to enlist. Nevertheless, the prosecutor dismissed these explanations and insisted that the defector be punished severely. And this is the text from the pamphlet. If we were a state like all others, we would have sentenced a defectors like all states do. But since we do not have the power of a state, I suggest we put the defendant in the shame corner as a coward. And after the war, when the gates of the land of Israel open, we would discuss whether the defendant has the right to come to Israel or would he be sentenced to eternal exile. Now, it's a very long pamphlet, and here's a spoiler, right? The Holocaust survivor eventually comes around and presents themselves for recruitment. But in reality, many did not, and indeed, more sometimes violent steps were taken concurrently to convince those refusing to enlist. Now, this tactic of tailoring a message to each locality where Jews or Arabs were to be, lived in was actually very effective in 1948, be it in Syria or Lebanon, Iraq, Morocco, and even in the United States. This transnational mobilization campaign was a very successful one. Now, in the second part of the journey in Dear Palestine, referred to here as indoctrination, I examined the socialization of these young men and women after enlistment with the official party line. And here I do a close reading of educational materials from the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, and the Arab League's volunteer army known as the Arab Liberation Army, or the ALA, which was a 5,000 strong volunteer force fighting alongside Palestinians in the early stages of war. And this propaganda answered the critical question of who is the enemy and pressured soldiers to repress competing interpretations not in accord with the officially sanctioned understanding of Zionism or the brand of Arab nationalism espoused by the ALA. One of the most common themes in pamphlets distributed to soldiers by Zionist army education officers was comparing the Arabs to Amalek and the 7 nations of Canaan, the biblical nation that the Israelites were commanded to exterminate. The view that Arabs were descendants of the arch nemesis of the Israelites was one that was actually long suppressed in Western rabbinic tradition. And in reviving it, the education officer bridged the gap between the brutal ideology of the revisionist right in the Yishuv and the supposed moderate view of labor Zionism in the Haganah. Now, it's a blood-curdling kind of propaganda, and I won't go into the gory details right now. What's interesting to note is that senior leadership in the IDF realized already in 1948 that what they were peddling was a radical departure from the view of many Jews with traditional Jewish education. And here's Yosef Karkobi, head of the IDF Education Service in 1948, explaining to his officers why hatred of Arabs is important, but also tricky. And this is what he says in a meeting with education officers. There's a danger that we would be overly influenced by the Jewish tradition that rules out crude hatred. We need to adjust our state of mind to the new conditions. That is why we need to nurture the hate instinct, but we need to put limits to hatred. It has to be rational. We must explain to the soldier why they have to hate the enemy, and they would hate him as long as there's a reason. This is rational hatred that fits the Jewish nature. Now, we'll come back in a little bit to that because I want to see and tell you a little bit about how soldiers regarded that attempt. But before that, let me say a word on the LA propaganda. It was somewhat different. On the one hand, it made these grand and wholly unsubstantiated promises to, quote unquote, liberate Palestine. And what that actually meant was not always explained. And here's Fauzi El-Kaoukji, commander of the Arab Liberation Army, in a famous address to Palestinians upon entering the country in early 48. This is what he delivered. We come to you today as a vanguard for the Arab armies that would follow one after another to the rescue. Hundreds of millions of Arabs and Muslims are standing behind us, and they swore to keep the immortal Arabness of Palestine. We all come with one heart and one goal: to annul the UN partition decision, to destroy the landmarks of Zionism and eliminate it altogether. Now, one major Israeli talking point that everyone who grew up in Israel would be familiar with is the claim that the Arabs, and it's never specified who this exactly refers to, had this genocidal intent in 1948, most commonly referred to as an intention to, quote unquote, push Jews into the sea. What's interesting is that this claim is made already in the midst of the 48 war in speeches by Ben-Gurion and in education materials for Israeli soldiers. And I actually set out to examine whether or not the ALA propaganda and some other propaganda among Palestinian militia forces, whether or not that it makes that point. As far as I could tell, it does not. And that's something I'm actually happy to talk more about during our discussion. Invested a lot of time reading hundreds and hundreds of pages of Arabic propaganda to look at that point. But let's continue with our journey. In the third part of Dear Palestine, referred to here as First Impression, we finally get to hear the soldiers themselves and the way they explain the reasons for coming to Palestine and what actually being there meant for them and their loved one back home. And I think these personal letters actually challenge some long-standing assumption about both Islamic and Judaic solidarity, not to mention the efforts of elite to create unified national visions. Rather than the assertion that jihad was the primary motivation for Arab volunteers, which is a central claim by Benny Morris, the most acclaimed historian of the war, Dear Palestine argues that the participation in the 48 war was driven by complex and often surprising interests and causes. And this is true for Jews as well. One example that I'll come back to later is Moroccan Jewish volunteers and their families in Morocco, who regarded the Jews taking up arms in Palestine as signaling an end to their inferior status as dhimmis in Morocco and possibly elsewhere in the Middle East. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. Now, once the scale of violence brought about by the war became apparent to Jews and Arabs, what ensued was a re-examination of their identities and the role of these identities in a larger political project. And that's the fourth part of our journey, which centers around violence. And here's the way the Deir Yassin massacre of April 1948 influenced a young Palestinian man. Deir Yassin was a village west of Jerusalem that had signed a non-belligerence agreement with the nearby Jewish settlement. Nevertheless, Jewish militia forces killed 125 Palestinian civilians upon occupying the village on April 9th, 1948, including women and children. And this is what a young Palestinian writes to his sister after the massacre as he gets ready to leave for military training with the ALA in Syria. I'll come back from Syria with hundreds of Syrian, Egyptian, and Iraqi fighters, and they will be the ones to determine the fate of this country. I solemnly promise you that I will never forget the Deir Yassin affair. I will publish it in the Syrian newspaper and in the different clubs, and I will spread anti-Zionist propaganda all over Syria. I will induce a spirit of revenge in the hearts of the Syrian youth, and they will come to Palestine full of rage and wrath against the Jews. So clearly, Deir Yassin was a watershed moment for this young man. It has called him to leave his village and travel to Syria for military training with the ALA, something that not many Palestinians did. In fact, the Palestinian leadership had major problems mobilizing the population to fight. Many of these were structural problems of infighting within the Palestinian elite and related to the exhaustion after the 36-39 Arab revolt a decade earlier. Also, there was this great sense of confidence that Arab soldiers from elsewhere were such a powerful force that mobilization of Palestinians themselves may not be as important. Now, this young man was also convinced that all he needed to do was to turn the tide in Palestine was to, quote unquote, induce the spirit of revenge. something he would very quickly discover was not so easy, particularly because Arab leaders themselves were not quite interested in such revolutionary spirit to take over their population. They feared that this would backfire against them and their own authoritarian regimes, and they stopped a lot of those mobilization and recruitment for the war in Palestine. Now, on the Jewish side as well, I'm interested in what sense of community violence prompted and what ordinary people made of Kalkobi's observation that I quoted earlier about the quote unquote Jewish nature. Now, to speak to this, let me give you an example from a letter by a female Jewish soldier. She wrote her family about several horrific war crimes that she witnessed, including the burning alive of Syrian officers by IDF soldiers. And I'll spare you the gory details, but let's join the writer for the last paragraph of her letter. I think that if the Jewish guys are expected to fight and murder legitimately, like the soldiers of other nations, they too should be allowed to erupt and kill just like that, out of revenge and pleasure. At first, it was hard for me to believe and get used to the idea that a Jewish soldier from a good kosher home can abuse people in such a horrific way. The last battles taught me a lot and opened my eyes. Now, by stating the Jews should be like all other nations, this soldier was making an ideological choice in one of the oldest debates inside the Zionist movement in the late 19th century. It's then that we find these two distinct strands. One that sided with becoming a nation like all other nations, Hibu kechol hagoyim, and at its core of this idea was the desire to imitate the populist and chauvinist nationalism that was so popular in Europe at the turn of the century, and among other things, celebrate the use of force. The other strand was often referred to as light unto nation, or Or Lagoim in Hebrew, which is a verse from Isaiah. This view openly rejected the use of force as a means of advancing Zionist goals and instead emphasized the moral aspects of Judaism and what its adherents saw as Judaism's universal message, that is the so-called light unto nation. Now, by stating that the battles had opened their eyes, it would seem that the writer came to accept the view that violence was constitutive to the creation of a Jewish state. Now, Dear Palestine concludes in the moment when the chaos sort of clears in 1949 and the results of the war become apparent. The loss of a homeland for Palestinians and the creation of a new homeland for some Jews. And it's this fifth and last stop in the Dear Palestine journey that I refer to here as reflection. In this immediate aftermath of the war, Zionist elite could have been pretty content. Most Ashkenazi Jews, that is Jews of European origin, became convinced that violence was constitutive part of membership in a community of Western nations and not at all contradictory to Jewish tradition. And this marked a resounding success for Zionist political and military elite who pushed for this view. And so in the case of these soldiers, complex identities gave way to a more reduced binary identities as dictated from above. Now, for many, the 1948 war was indeed a return to history, and that's another Zionist concept from the late 19th century. This idea of return to history maintained that only modern Jewish nationalism could allow Jews to transcend 2 millennia of supposed passivity. And that was an appealing sentiment, as letters clearly show. And here's one from an American volunteer. We're making history on a grandiose scale, but in an astonishingly short time. A group of devoted daydreamers, full of belief, and an army which started as a group of partisans succeeded to generate a revolution, one bigger than what 2,000 years of misery, prayers, bribery, quips, and humiliations have managed to do. Now, but this was not everyone's view, and significant dissent did come up. Let me read to you a short excerpt from a letter by another American Jewish volunteer who came to fight in 48. In his letter, intercepted by Israel, the author writes that he had initially intended to stay in Israel and move there permanently, but now he changed his mind and he wants to go back to the US immediately. This is what he writes. Israel would win the war, it should win, and it would win because this is a just cause, although the people representing it are not worthy to play this historical role. A golem is being formed here, and no one knows how it would turn when it grows. And we American Jews helped to create this golem, but without having any say on its moves. At any rate, the Jews of Israel abandoned their religion for a revolver in every respect. So for those unfamiliar with this term golem, the golem was this mythical creature that was believed to be artificially created by European Jews in the Middle Ages to protect their communities in times of need, sort of a Frankenstein-like creature. For the most famous such stories connected with the Maharal of Prague, who in the spring of 1580 created the golem to protect the Jewish community there after he had heard a priest nearby incited the population to attack Jews. The golem did protect the Jews of Prague. However, it then started to run wild, attacking innocent bystanders. And to this soldier I just quoted, Israel was such a golem, right? A tool ostensibly created for the purpose of protecting Jews, but then unleashing unchecked violence against innocents. Now, the Jewish tradition he was brought up on rejected the idea that Jews could be a quote unquote nation like all other nations and adopt the Gentile way of war. And he left Israel somewhat disenchanted with Zionism. Now, unsurprisingly, in the aftermath of the war, the concerns of Palestinians were quite different. For Palestinians, the immediate aftermath of the Nakba did not only bring material losses and displacement, but also depression and grief. Many yearned for Palestine's beloved landscape, as this refugee from Amman wrote to a POW inside Israel in February of 1949. How are you and how are your oranges? We don't get to see them here. One orange here is worth a camel's head, meaning very expensive. Now, life in a POW would of course seem unenviable, but it appeared differently from the vantage point of this refugee in Amman, where he was deprived of the citrus that was so evocative of home. Now, from this perspective, being a POW meant maintaining a connection to these mundane aspects of life that for refugees had altogether disappeared. One Palestinian poet who witnessed the expulsion of Palestinians from Majd ibn Amr or the Jezreel Valley compared it to the expulsion of Muslims from Al-Andalus or Muslim Spain, meaning along similar lines. Now, the permanence of this displacement was not immediately clear to Palestinians. Many believed that return was around the corner, like this female refugee from Transjordan who wrote an acquaintance still in Jaffa in October of 48. Please inform me if the house was completely ransacked or only partially, because there's a lot of news about stealing and robbery in Jaffa, and I am very concerned. Now, in answering a similar query, a Palestinian from Ma'aka or Acre wrote to his family abroad in July 49. Most buildings were taken by Jews and the gardens and vegetable fields were transferred into their hands in full. All this is the result of Arab men sitting in coffee houses speaking empty words. Now, personal letters indicated that once the failure of the old leadership to quote unquote liberate Palestine became clear for everyone to see, the way ordinary Palestinians sought to move forward was by launching a grassroots campaign of return with or without the participation of the old class of notables, which was still trying to hang on to its privileges. By 1949, many Palestinians realized that a return to Palestine at that point could only be facilitated by their families who became Israeli citizens. And so for the majority of Palestinians who were unable to obtain the government's permission for the return of their loved ones, calling on their families to sneak across the border into Israel was the only way of reuniting their families. But of course, not everyone was convinced to allow something like that. And here's a letter by a female Palestinian in Israel to a refugee family in Lebanon. How is our dear father, and why doesn't he listen to what I say and take my advice? After all, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Read him my words. As long as the movement of people continues between Arab states and Israel, and others are paying thousands of liras to do it, why did your feeling die and your right mind disappear? Now, as Palestinians were trying to make their way back into Israel, Moroccan Jews in Israel were attempting to take the opposite route. Out of Israel. Some 20,000 had left Morocco to Israel by that point, and about 1,000 of them served in the IDF during the war. The letters from June 49 among these group of Moroccan Jews, who I look at extensively in the book, depict a very interesting process of disenchantment of Moroccan Jews in Israel. And this will be the last letter that I share with you. Here's a letter of a Moroccan Jewish soldier in the IDF from 1949. He writes the following: as I wrote to you, the European Jews who suffered tremendously from the Hitleristic Nazism see themselves as a superior race, and the Sephardic as belonging to an inferior one. The poor African who came here from afar and was not required to leave his home because of racial discrimination is now humiliated at every turn. Instead of gratitude, they treat us like savages or unwelcomed element. Bloodline rules here. Now, this letter actually requires some decoding. On the one hand, the soldier is using a vocabulary associated with Nazi Germany to describe the hegemonic group of European Jews, suggesting that they created this racial hierarchy based on blood, with themselves at the top and Sephardic Jews as racially inferior subjects. Another subversive element here is the assertion that unlike European Jews, were forced out of Europe because of anti-Semitism, most Africans did not suffer racial discrimination in their countries of origin. Now, this, of course, goes against the Zionist narrative, which saw the bringing of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa to Israel as a rescue mission that averted a second Holocaust supposedly perpetrated by the Arab. Now, the Army Command was very concerned of this trend, and we actually know from statistics that were secretly collected from letters that over 70% of Moroccan Jewish soldiers in the IDF wanted to leave Israel and return to Morocco because of what they defined as racial discrimination. They also called their families often not to join them in Israel. Let me wrap up. Israel was very effective in blocking the return of Moroccan Jews to Morocco in 1949. It did that by confiscating passports of those arriving and launching this propaganda campaign aimed at Jews that were still considering to come to Israel. But of course, the most significant war on return, as one scholar termed it, was against Palestinian. The attempt to prevent the return was one of the primary endeavors of the Israeli government, not without the support of the country's Jewish population. The letters of Palestinians intercepted by Israel were used to uncover routes used by Palestinians trying to smuggle the border into what was now Israel. These Palestinians were often ambushed as they tried to return. Countless were arrested and expelled a second time between 1949 and 1956, and between 2,700 and 5,000 were shot and killed as they tried to cross into Israel after the formal end of the war. Now, the only group who could effortlessly perform a return to their old homeland in the aftermath of the 48th war was this group of disenchanted Jewish volunteers from a fluent country. Some refused to accept the marriage between Judaism and violence and saw Israel resort to militarism as un-Jewish or immoral. But even they did not sever their ties with the Jewish state altogether, because their privileged position often allowed them to return to the place of birth, but keep Israel as a possible place of refuge. Conversely, of course, most Ashkenazi soldiers in the aftermath of 48 were either born in Palestine or were Holocaust survivors who did not see Israel's resort to militarism as un-Jewish, nor were they interested in an alternative homeland, possibly because one was not available for them in the aftermath of the Second World War. They strongly believed that being like all other nations was the Jewish calling, and indeed felt that they achieved a Jewish return to history. Thank you so much, and I look forward for our discussion.
Thank you, Professor Hassani, for so richly informative and well-organized talk. Let us now turn to our discussant for today, Professor Wendy Perlman. Wendy Perlman is professor of political science at Northwestern University, where she also holds the Charles Deering McCormick Professorship of Teaching Excellence. A specialist in the comparative politics of the Middle East, she is the author of 4 books. She has conducted research in Spain, Germany, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Israel, and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Over to you, Professor Perlman.
Great, thank you much. And everyone can hear me okay? It's always better to ask. Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to discuss a truly marvelous book. Dear Palestine offers a fresh, exciting, insightful perspective on defining events in the history of Israel and the Palestinians, and truly one of the most important landmarks of the entire contemporary history of the Middle East. This book is not simply a tremendously significant scholarly contribution, but it's also a fabulous read. It will be accessible and captivating for any general reader. So for those of you who are in the audience and don't normally like to read academic books, do not be intimidated by this one. It will draw you right in, and you'll want to turn every page. I'll frame my comments around what I see are 4 innovations that this work makes and what makes it so unique and valuable. And I would really say path-breaking. Along the way, I'll pose some questions for Shai. And Shai, you can answer any of these questions you wish or none at all. I'll just pose them in the interest of fostering discussion. So the first innovation is the perspective or level of analysis that Shai brings to the 1948 war. And as discussed in that terrific presentation, it makes a shift from the elite level of political, diplomatic, military history to social history from below. We get to see the war from the perspective of the ordinary soldiers who fought it and some of the ordinary civilians who experienced it. We get to learn their motivations, see their doubts, their changes of heart, their reflections, their understandings, all from their point of view. As Shai mentioned in his opening remarks, it can be very common to hear the messaging of political leaders or military institutions and infer that their messages and narratives represent the opinion of everyone those institutions purport to represent. And Shai shows us why that is a folly and shows us what we miss when we take that point of view. He takes us inside and below to explore what soldiers and civilians believed and felt. How does he do this? Well, that takes us to the next major innovation of the book, and that is sources, the shift from official documents to this never before used source of letters written by and to soldiers, these firsthand narratives, and as well the letters from civilians. This is incredibly unique, a treasure trove, as Shai put it. We have these personal letters as well as other copious materials written in Arabic, Hebrew, Yiddish, English, and French. The use of these sources is a credit to Shai's own intuitions, and I hope he'll get to tell us more about the story of how he came upon these letters, and his intuitions that there was something very, very special going on here, and then the tenacity that he showed in doing all he needed to do to get a hold of those letters, to get access to as many of them as he could, even to the point of suing the Israeli state to make available this incredible window into these events. The story of those sources and the entire question of classification of sources and censorship of these letters is itself, of course, worthy of a book in its own right, including the essential paradox that it was state censorship of these letters through the Postal Censorship Bureau that Shai discussed. The state censorship is what preserved these voices in an archive and allows us to hear them now. Of course, after Shai worked very hard to allow us to get to hear them. On the one hand, unlike official documents and state propaganda, these letters capture voices from below. But on the other hand, unlike oral histories, which are often a way of capturing from below social history voices, these letters capture them, as Shai said, in real time. So my first question to Shai is, coming as somebody who's engaged in oral history herself, I'd like to ask you about that difference. How do you think that in real time aspect the time-stamped aspect of these letters, like the text from the Russian soldier that you opened our conversation with. How does it challenge, supplement, and add to oral history, which has been a form of histories on 1948, and especially Palestinian histories on 1948? What do letters of this sort teach us that reflection long after the fact cannot? And what does it even teach us about what we do gather when we gather testimonies long after events? Another observation on sources, and that is, as Shai discussed, this book doesn't rely exclusively on personal letters. It also puts those letters in conversation with state level or political level, elite level propaganda that sought to recruit and indoctrinate some of the very writers of those letters. As we see in newspaper and radio broadcasts and pamphlets and educational materials and other materials. As Shai said in his opening remarks, we get to see how non-elites interact with elite narratives. In that sense, we see history not only from the bottom up, but also the interaction of the bottom up and the top down. So that leads me to a second question. What do you think, Shai, that this dialogue between personal letters and recruitment and indoctrination sources teaches us that we might not understand looking at those letters alone? Because we can imagine you might have written a book only using the letters. That would have been more than enough. Why did you make the choice to also have that in the dialogue with the other more elite sources, and what does that bring out in the letters? So what does Shai do with all these sources? This brings me to a third point in innovation of the book, form. The book is crafted and structured to tell a story, and in Shai's words from the presentation, to take us on a journey. And I think that's what makes this book so engaging and will also make it so welcome to a large and general readership. That journey follows a special arc within the arc of the 1948 war, and that's the arc of the lived experience of soldiers and fighters who came to Palestine from near and from far to fight it, following those stages of mobilization, indoctrination, impressions, violence, and reflections. So a third question is, Shai, how did you come to present your research in this way, as this story? How did you come to craft the story? How in the course of your research did you realize that this was the arc, this was a story that you could tell, that your data was telling you, and was the best way to present the material? The fourth and final point I'd like to emphasize here is this key scholarly contribution of the book that Shai said, the ambition that might try to overpromise, but I would say no, that the book truly delivers. And that fourth point is on critiquing categories and critiquing narratives. The book shifts us from easy, assumed binaries of Arab and Jew as two homogeneous monoliths, to probing all the complexity and diversity of the individuals, the identities, the attachments, the ranging local motivations that all of those binaries typically obscure. We get to meet the array of different individuals who come to fight on behalf of Israel or who come to fight on behalf of the Palestinians. And these individuals don't always think and do what we might expect. We get to see Arab volunteers from across the Arab world who complain about the very Palestinian civilians that they have taken up arms to protect, and vice versa. Some of those Palestinian civilians complaining about the Arab volunteers who come to rescue and save them. We get to see North American Jewish volunteers deeply disturbed by Jewish and Israeli use of force, Moroccan Jews so fed up with racism from Ashkenazi Jews that they want to return, and they urge their families never to migrate to Israel. Deconstructing the binary between Arab and Jew moves us beyond simplified narratives about the war to the contradictory, messy, confusing, and sometimes painful and heart-wrenching meanings of violence for both those who use it and those who are its victims. And the many, many stories and voices and anecdotes that really bring the book to life. There's one that struck me in chapter 3 on page 132, this anecdote about the leaders of 3 Jewish settlements who actually came to the ALA, the Arab Liberation Army, and asked these Arab fighters to protect them from the Haganah, which they feared were confiscating their property. And as Shai mentions in the book, the details of this anecdote are very opaque. We don't know exactly what happened, but Shai's analysis is powerful as a takeaway. And he says, and I quote, that this anecdote captures a moment when identities were still in formation. Only a few years later, this incident, essentially the Jews going to Arabs to seek protection from Jewish forces, he says, only a few years later, this incident would have been unimaginable. So this leads me to my final question, and this is a question that occurs to me as a political scientist who is trained to search for generalizable theory. And I realize that's a very unfair question to ask to a historian, and this is precisely what makes political scientists so annoying for historians, but I can't help myself, so I'll ask it anyway. And that is, what do you think your research suggests for how we might think about identities in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli identities and Palestinian identities since 1948 and even today? That is because identities are always in formation, though perhaps not always to the same degree. What about the complexity of identities and categories and narratives and motivations that you capture do you believe is unique to this special time before 1948 or during the war itself? And what of this complexity and this deconstructing binaries do you think is valuable as a lesson and analytical approach for us today? What of this should encourage us to adopt perhaps a more critical perspective on identities and narratives since then? And that is, if we take up the elements that I think make your approach so innovative in terms of perspective from below, sources that capture real-time identities and perspectives from below, and critiquing these categories and narratives, the form of seeing a story in unfolding events, what might they reveal in today's world that we often don't see, or perhaps lead us to rethink what we take for granted about what Israel and Palestinians and the Arab world are all about? There's so much more to say, but I'll wrap it up there to leave time for discussion.
Well, thank you, Professor Perlman. Well, Professor Hassani, before we proceed to the Q&A, perhaps you might take up some of Professor Perlman's questions.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you so much, Wendy, for these comments and your amazing work. I mean, I've taught your work on the first Intifada, the more sort of political, scientific work in my class on the settler movement and Israeli occupation. And of course, your amazing work in Syria and my Survey Middle East class, which I feel like is almost a work in history, but let's put that in a different conversation. But thank you so much. Obviously I can't address all of these also because I don't have good answers for all of these. The last question is, of course, the most difficult one. Which I sort of read as, what is the more, how is this applicable to larger conversations that maybe we're having today? The short answer is that I don't know. I mean, I come from this world, I started as a reporter and I thought I was very naive and thought that, things would change if people only knew or things like that. And obviously was disenchanted for some of these ideas. But to address this in my little small sort of word of history scholarship, I would say that I hope that it is a valuable perspective to bring forward in the context, today, someone analyzes the current Israeli society and would say, oh, well, Jews that descend from Middle Eastern and North African descent, they vote overwhelmingly to the right, or at least that's the perspective, although that was nuanced as well. And that's because of their treatment in Arab lands and anti-Semitism there and jihadism and you name it, right? And this actually shows that story is much more messier, right? And so that there's a significant shift, and this is also my new research looking at these North Africans from 49 to 59, this massive revolt in Israel called the Wadi Salib revolt, and seeing their radicalization and what that brings to. And so these are some significant shifts, right? They're all historically, have a context, and they shifted one way in some context, they may shift another way in another context. And so that's something that, at least, if I had, teenagers read some excerpts in some high school, I don't know if that is feasible or possible. That is a sort of a takeaway that I would like them to go with, and something that connects to that, and I think also answers the question of why I was so attracted to these on my own, is because, in the context of the post-Oslo area, we won't go into that, but, and active leftist activism in Israel, right? It's often claimed that these moral anti-occupation, anti-apartheid voices, etc., are a zeitgeist, are a product of their time, and they are a product of shifts in the world, globalization, other things, but they have a trajectory that I think you can link to even as early as 1948, maybe even before, right? And so when we see an American Jewish volunteer saying that Israel is a golem and that they traded their religion for a revolver, and you see, and you have all these dissenting voices, I think that these voices are connected to larger dissension among Jewish population, and later on in later decades, and that's just reading these for the first time, literally after that source has accidentally fallen on my head, literally by complete coincidence. That was very, very appealing to me, because that thinking, everyone says, oh, well, this breaking the silence Israeli sort of leftist Zionist group, they're part of this post-2000, but you will never find this. This is not something that existed at all. And literally, some scholars, including some formative scholars of the history of Zionism, write this, that none of this existed. And we actually see that it did exist. It's not the same, it's not identical, but something is there, and I think is worth unearthing. And so that's my way to evade your question about the current sort of. You asked them about the letters and this idea of real time. I think they capture something different, not better, not worse, but they capture a certain, it is a version of yourself as well, just like oral testimonies are a version of the self, but they capture something that is somewhat different, or a little bit different than oral history. I would have not gone into this if I had not read mostly Palestinian oral history of the Nakba, because the questions are coming from there, right? And I was wondering myself, because again, that argument that you would have not found that same narrative or identical narrative is a very common, pervasive one, and that's something. And I worked for like 13 years to find these Arabic sources, because I thought that they were, I was really eager to locate such sources. And of course, Israel in its surveillance apparatus was very interested in those sentiments of ordinary people, Jews for sure, soldiers, etc., but Palestinian and refugee camps, right? Reports after reports of this exchange between these refugees and Palestinians who became Israeli citizens. And so that's something that was very, very attractive to me. And I think I see that in the same sort of trajectory of the work with oral history, and I think that it gives us a different aspect of that. Okay, I think we want to open it for questions, and I'll try to address some of the other questions and as we go along.
Okay, so now I'd like to, as they say, open the floor to questions. Now, to ask a question, you'll need to use Zoom's raise hand feature. So to do this, please click on the icon labeled reactions in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and then click on the tab labeled raise hand. Has anyone any questions? Okay. Yes, question from Joel Michael.
When you talk about these letters and that they're being censored, to me that creates the image of the letters didn't get to their destination as written. Is that true? And were they clipping out sentences or blacking out sentences?
Absolutely. Thank you for this
Okay.
question. Yes, and that's something I try to tackle a little bit in the book. And there's also a documentary about this unit of postal censorship bureau that is being produced in Israel with some of the research that I've done. Yes, so the sort of the reason of existence for this unit was supposedly to prevent classified information from reaching behind enemy lines. And certainly they redacted parts of letters. But what they also did, and that was their real reason for existence, is extract sort of generalized or extract parts of letters and sometimes complete letters in order to allow Israeli leadership to know what these groups based on ethnicity, soldiers, Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Palestinians, etc., what they think, what it was called their state of mind. And so sometimes certainly the letters as written, especially if it included a subversive element, they were not released, and that part was redacted, and that may have not been delivered to the recipient. However, that part of the letter, or sometimes the entire letter, was copied, extracted, and often included in those intelligence reports that were sent to Israeli leadership. Now, that's not the only source I use for letter. I also use these letters of mostly Arab volunteers in that ALA that were confiscated in postal offices and from dead bodies of soldiers, etc. So I use a mix of sources, but for that censorship, certainly we do not know. Probably many of these letters were not delivered.
Okay, next question. And please do remember to unmute yourself. We have a question that's been written in the chat column. So I'll relay it to you. The question concerned, I can't see it right now, but the question concerned declassification. And the questioner, Neil Ormos, was wondering what obstacles you met with in your legal fight to have files declassified.
Thanks, and that's a topic that I'm really interested in. For some reason, not that many people find the archival declassification regulation the most exciting topic. I can't understand why, but I hear that that's a common sentiment. This is it sometimes has been very, very challenging. I found this source by accident, meaning literally an accident of the archives, which allowed it to be referenced in another file. And it took a very long time, many years, in fact, for some, we don't have a lot of it, some of these files to be declassified. Israel has a complicated position here because on the one hand, it has these massive archival apparatuses that are supposed to be open to the public, and compared to everywhere else in the Middle East, they are relatively open. And Israel does adhere to this German model of declassification, but of course, Israel is very actively attempting to hide certain aspects of its history, specifically 1948, also some parts pertaining to Israeli occupation post-1967. And so getting these sources have often been very challenging. Most of them are from the archives of the Israel Defense Forces, but a lot of these sources that were relevant to the study are actually kept in a separate archive, the Shin Bet archive, that is completely inaccessible to scholars. And I attempted for many years to petition getting these sources and was blocked. Eventually in 2019, we wrote a petition to the Israeli Supreme Court that was litigated for several years by the Association of Civil Rights in Israel, who did this pro bono. the case was rejected, so we didn't get the sources from the Shin Bet archives, but there is some room there to continue that legal struggle, and I do hope that others will take this up. It's a complicated thing. Israel has not only its own archives and sources of these intelligence apparatuses, but literally in some significant way, the Palestinian archive is being subsumed into the Israeli archive, right? The Arabic sources, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of them, we only scratch the surface of that, and they are in the Israeli archives. Much of them are not accessible to the public. Much of them are in the Shin Bet archives. This is the cultural heritage, right, of Palestinians. And I hope, and that's something that I've been involved in, that others will take this up, because what happens in politics, a separate thing. I think that is the cultural heritage of a different people held by, in this case, Israel, is not something we should accept or be fine with. And that's a larger story that hopefully we'll get to talk about at some point.
So I'll abuse my privilege as moderator and ask a question myself. One of the great novelties of your book is its recourse to these never before used personal letters intercepted by the Israeli Censorship Bureau, which was really the successor to Britain's Imperial Censorship Bureau. Wendy, Professor Perlman alluded to this. How did you come upon this this trove of letters?
Thanks. So this goes back to a time where I was still working as a journalist, TV correspondent. It's very strange to think about that. Quite a few years after, almost 15, and I was producing a short documentary about something completely different. Something that had to do with Israel arms deal, and just reading a document pertaining to an arms deal where Israel was selling arms to West Germany in the 50s, that created a huge uproar in Israel and in the Jewish population, of course, because of the Holocaust and the extermination of European Jews by Nazi Germany. And just some bureaucrat who had filed a report in the documents I was looking at had mentioned that, for the prime minister, if he may be interested in what in this case, IDF soldiers thought about that arms deal, well, then of course he can read their personal letters sent to their loved ones in this and this file in this report. And, I was like, what is this? Very peculiar. And I, went with it to the archivists and the IDF archives at the time, and until today are this very strange thing, sort of a military compound in some significant ways. And I was like, I want to see this. And it's like, well, and this, and I'm not sure if it exists, and it doesn't, it may not, it may. And it actually took a few years to locate that. And as I was waiting to hear about that, I tried to find these people on my own, right? Because if there was an apparatus that copied these letters, this is not a small thing, right? It's not one person. So I found out that from 1948 all the way to 2005 or 3, don't catch me on that year, this apparatus of copying secretly the correspondence of all sorts of groups, right? Of soldiers, of Ashkenazi, of Mizrahi Jews, of Palestinians under occupation, and Palestinian citizens of Israel, and tourists and foreign journalists, you name it. This was a very extensive apparatus, and I found some people that were involved with it. Some of them were willing to share their experience. And I was working to try and get these sources from the archive. And it's a difficult argument to say that this is classified. And this is an argument that Israel makes a lot, right? That you cannot declassify a certain document. And I have some files that went up to the Israeli cabinet for a decision that they would be blocked. But it's hard to make the case that a personal letter of, me or my friend or my neighbor, right, a non-elite writing to their parents is this major state secret. Now, that case has been made, certainly in some cases that I appealed to get these documents, but it's a hard case to make. And eventually, after several years, I was able to get some of these sources, certainly not all that I wanted, but some of these, and they're now open for the for everyone to look at. And I hope there are many more people that are interested and would be interested in that sort of perspective derived from these letters.
Any other questions?
I think there's someone raising their hand.
Yes.
I couldn't see it anymore, but for a second I saw it. So I can't see it anymore, but for a second
Yeah.
there, it said someone was raising their hand.
Yes, Ram Yogev.
Yeah, thanks for a very interesting talk. I just wonder, how did you pick up the letter into the book? Did you have a preset agenda of what you're looking for? Or was it decided during reading those thousands of letters?
Thanks so much. That was one of the most difficult things to do, and it goes back to some of Wendy's question about the narrative arc. You know, I've written this as a doctoral dissertation, and it was okay, but it was not very readable. And then the editor at Stanford Press was like, great topic, maybe write an actual book with it and come up with a story that has a progression and time and themes. And you know, of course she was right. And that was one of the best advices I got. And to begin with, you know, I looked at these letters. I was very interested, I say it and I discuss in the book, in the dissenting views, right? Not in the sense, you know, sometimes I had a broader sense of what the larger population of soldiers were saying or arguing, for example, in the Moroccan case, because the state was very concerned about them and kept this very detailed statistics saying 70% of them wanted to leave Israel and return to Morocco. But for a lot of the other letters, I don't have that. So what I had is, you know, not organized by any specific theme and sort of all over the place, these pretty massive amounts of letters. I just started reading them and, you know, try to look at what seemed to be more sort of hegemonic voices, but also I was certainly, and that's a major something I'm interested in, not making a claim for, you know, statistical significance, with the exception of some small parts of the book. That's what I was interested in. And in fact, it was at first sort of all over the place. And then that idea of looking at what I call the indoctrination came about, because that whole discussion about, like, you know, Judaism and violence and some of the other discussions that are happening among that soldier population, especially based on ethnicities, seemed to be, I had the feeling that it must be stemming from somewhere, like, where are these ideas coming from? A lot of these people are recent immigrants. And so I started looking at the education material. Now, the education apparatus, especially in the IDF, that's what I started with, was a significant one. It had hundreds of people already in 1949, over 500 of them. And so they had a significant program in place of sort of educating these people coming from all over the world, specifically talking about Jews right now, for, you know, the Zionist idea, the war, etc. And so I started trying to look for some of these trajectories that may come from this education material. That doesn't mean that everything that was said, you know, was internalized. Sometimes it was accepted, sometimes it was rejected, sometimes it was negotiated. There's a lot of sentiments that are going on there. But that's sort of some of the connections that I was looking to make throughout that work, and that was a complicated process to try and make sense of this source, which the source itself came with some like larger explanation of what it all means and what you can do with it. Fortunately, that's not how these sources usually present themselves in the archival or research part. So that answers some of that question.
Any other questions? Well, if you'll allow me, I'll ask one more. Well, one of the ambitions, or depending on one's perspective, successes of Zionism was its reinvention of the Jew, right? Gone was the feeble, decrepit, bookish schlemiel of the diaspora. And in his place came the robust, self-assured, dauntless sovereign, right? And in your book, you make a point I've not seen elsewhere, that there was a similar attempt at human re-engineering on the side of the Palestinians, as say exemplified by such groups as Najada and Futua. Could you expand on this?
Yeah, and that's something that came, I was writing the introduction after the book was written, and especially looking, this is not only something, it does go on among Palestinians, and some of it is attempt to imitate what's going on in the Zionists, but it's going on in other parts of the Middle East, right? In Syria, in Lebanon, right? These militarized youth movements that talk about masculinity and those parallel. I mean, I was just sort of reading the whole work at the end, including those letters of volunteers from the Arab world, and I couldn't help but pointing out at some of those parallels that I saw in, right, because the discussion of Jewish masculinity is not a Palestine-centered discussion. It comes to Palestine, but it starts elsewhere, right? It starts with Nordau. It starts with the inception of Zionism. Bardichevsky, Chernichovsky. These are the people that are talking about this, reshifting the Jewish man and the muscular Judaism, and it felt that there are some very strong parallels between that sentiment, right? That was, of course, aimed, among other things, at fighting against anti-Semitism and the perceptions of Jews by anti-Semitism, and ended up adopting some of those stereotypes. And I thought that there was a significant parallel among that you can find in Middle Eastern societies, especially in the Arab world, in the context of the fight against imperialism and colonialism, where you have that, right? You have the Iraqi equivalent, you have the still shirts in Syria and elsewhere, and they're using a discourse that I could not help but pointing out that had some very, very significant parallels. Doesn't mean it's the same. It means that it's a sort of a both sides kind of thing, but this discourse, the one talking about reinventing the Jewish man, and the one talking about reimagining the Arab man, had some very, very strong parallels. And unfortunately, I only came to it at the last part of my research and wasn't able to fully develop that. Maybe so.
Yes. I mean, these groups, the scouting clubs and these paramilitary formations, were so numerous across the Middle East, particularly in the interwar period. But I think you're analogizing Zionist ethic of Jewish regeneration to the Arab attempt to recover lost masculinity in reaction to debasement by Europeans. Was fascinating. Yes. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professors Perlman and Hassani. Thank you. And I just wanted to remind everyone that the fourth and final installment in our series will be, I believe, on March 30th. And it will feature David Barak Gorodetsky, who, as Professor Shai mentioned, will be presenting on his recently published book. It's a biography of Judah Magnus. So I do hope you'll join us then on March 30th. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.